Welcome to Eastbourne, one of the largest seaside resort towns on England's glittering south coast. Famed for its spectacular pleasure pier and its sprawling pebble beach, Eastbourne is full of places to sit back and relax by the sea. But the town is also filled with intriguing history, and on this walk we'll explore one of the most famous parts of Eastbourne, as we stroll past an array of immense Victorian hotels, historic churches and more, while we also delve into the secrets of what this grand seaside resort was like in the centuries before flocks of tourists began coming to town. All of that is to come over the next 25 minutes, but we begin our walk overlooking the immense Eastbourne Beach, which stretches for 4 miles along this sun-baked ribbon of English coastline. Like many beaches in this part of the country, Eastbourne Beach is a pebble beach, admittedly a bit uncomfortable for any barefooted sunbathers, but one which is also full of intriguing landmarks, bookended to the west by the famous cliffs at Beachy Head, and just here in the middle, home to the grand Eastbourne Pier, which we can see jutting out from dry land into the waters of the English Channel. We'll get a closer look at Eastbourne Pier in a few minutes' time. But just along the seafront from it here, we find another of this town's main entertainment venues, the huge Eastbourne Bandstand. With the Union flag flying high above it, the Eastbourne Bandstand is described as the busiest bandstand on planet Earth. Complete with a grand open-air auditorium with capacity for 1,600 people, the Eastbourne Bandstand was originally built in 1935. And it's entirely unique in Britain, both for its large size and its semicircular design, functioning more like a stage at a concert venue than your typical round bandstand in a local park. Developed back in the 1930s during a period of sweeping improvements to the town's seafront, the Eastbourne Bandstand today remains one of the town's most iconic landmarks, still hosting more than 100 concerts per year, most of which logically take place during the summer. If you're in Eastbourne and fancy catching a show at the bandstand, there's everything from big band shows to traditional music, and a vast array of tribute acts playing everything from the Rolling Stones to ELO, Ed Sheeran and much more. But probably the best of all are the famous 1812 fireworks shows, which you can see every Wednesday night here during the summer, and which always end on a triumphant note as fireworks explode across the seafront to the tune of Tchaikovsky's booming 1812 overture. So, with the grand bandstand occupying a prominent position on the town's seafront, it's immediately clear to us that Eastbourne is a resort town which is still attracting visitors by the bucket load, with its many events and things to do. However, when you're by the seaside, sometimes there's nothing better to do than simply take a stroll along the coast. And as we can see here, Eastbourne has its own immaculate promenade, which makes that an absolute treat. Following the line of the seafront for nearly 4 miles, Eastbourne's promenade is a landmark in itself. And the great thing is that it's almost always drenched with sun, just like today, because Eastbourne is commonly recognised as the sunniest town in the UK, with more than 180 hours of sunshine every month. It's no wonder then that the town's promenade is lined by rows upon rows of exotic palm trees, as Eastbourne is home to its own unusually warm and sunny microclimate, which is caused by the hills of the surrounding South Downs that act as a barrier around the town to any adverse weather systems. So remember, if you're banking on sunshine for a day by the sea, then Eastbourne is the place to come. With its spacious pebble beach here, a delightful place to enjoy the weather, and also to gaze out towards the historic Eastbourne Pier, certainly the jewel in the crown of this fabulous seaside town. Opened all the way back in 1870, this splendid pleasure pier juts out a modest 1,000 feet, or 300 metres, into the sea, and it was one of the first major developments in Eastbourne during the Victorian era, as local landowners sought to convert this seaside town into one of England's most exquisite resorts. Interestingly, the pier was originally meant to be built a little bit further along the beach where the Eastbourne Bandstand is today, but instead it was eventually constructed as the centrepiece of Eastbourne's seafront between some of the most luxurious hotels in town. Overlooking the pier and the beach just here, we encounter the immense Burlington Hotel, possibly the grandest Victorian hotel in Eastbourne's vast collection of historic lodgings. Built over the course of 4 years from 1851 to 1855, the Burlington is today home to 159 rooms and spans a row of 13 houses, which form part of a historic and spectacular white terraced building that was historically known as the Grand Parade, one of the oldest and most famous landmarks in all of Eastbourne. Historically though, the Grand Parade was home to not one, but 2 grand hotels, and if you look down to the end of the terrace, you'll see the empty space on the left, where there once stood the old Claremont Hotel, for a long-time neighbour to the Burlington Hotel, but which was sadly destroyed in a huge fire back in 2019. But the Claremont isn't the only famous Eastbourne landmark to have fallen victim to fire in the 21st century. In fact, we're lucky that the iconic Eastbourne Pier is still standing today, because it was also struck by a huge blaze during the height of summer in 2014. Though impressively restored in the years since, those who know Eastbourne will know that the pier is now missing a big part as a result of the fire, as historically, in the middle of the pier there used to stand a huge Victorian-era dance hall, once upon a time a prime venue for grand balls and events for all those who came to visit this seaside town. The mostly wooden dance hall was unfortunately gutted by the fire, and where it once stood, you'll now find a couple of smaller, modern buildings, home to various amusements for those walking out onto the pier as part of their holiday here in Eastbourne. Though now lacking a Victorian dance hall, Eastbourne Pier is better known for its wide array of amusements, including everything from an arcade to mini-golf and a collection of restaurants and eateries, all of which fit snugly onto the 1,000-foot-long boardwalk, which is one of the main centres of entertainment in the modern seaside town. But although pleasure piers have always been designed for just that, pleasure, when Eastbourne Pier was originally built, it also served as an important spot in the town's burgeoning social scene, as Eastbourne began life less as a seaside resort for the masses and more for the upper classes. Just across the road here, for example, we can see the Pier Hotel, which is housed inside what was once upon a time a block of grand Victorian houses, which were built in the 19th century by local landowners to provide wealthy holidaymakers with a place to stay right on the town's seafront. Now, long before the advent of seaside holidays for the masses, Britain's upper classes became obsessed with vacationing by the coast. Initially, this was because of the health benefits provided by bathing in the sea and taking in the fresh air of the coast. But as time went on, it simply became a fashionable thing to do, and Eastbourne knew how to take advantage of the trend. At the beginning of the 19th century, none of the buildings that we see on Eastbourne's seafront today existed. This was merely a small seaside town of a couple of thousand people, where most of the land was owned by 2 men, John Davies Gilbert and William Cavendish, the Earl of Burlington. Together, Davies Gilbert and the Earl of Burlington sought to develop Eastbourne into a luxurious seaside resort, home to a fashionable promenade, a great pier, and of course, an array of grand hotels. The Queen's Hotel that we're passing here, for example, being one of the last great Victorian lodgings that was built during that feverish period of development, as it dates from 1880. Now, Davies Gilbert and the Earl of Burlington were the pioneers of development here in Eastbourne. In fact, in the 1840s, the Earl of Burlington even planned to build an entirely new town here by the sea, named Burlington. Although that plan eventually fell through, and he had to settle simply for a grand hotel named after him. Roughly a decade later, however, the Earl recruited a London-based architect by the name of Henry Currie to do what he had never managed to do: develop a grand new seaside resort town that was built for gentlemen by gentlemen. And that's exactly what he managed, the modern town of Eastbourne drawing its origins from that order. In the second half of the 19th century, Eastbourne began to explode in popularity, benefiting both from sweeping new developments and a popular association with the celebrity of its day, as the then Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, was a regular visitor to Eastbourne during the Victorian era. Between 1850 and 1900, therefore, the town's population grew nearly tenfold, from around 4,000 to nearly 40,000. And as we can see here, there quickly developed a vast townscape that stretched far inland from the busy seafront, with grand roads like this one, known as Seaside Road, also playing host to popular destinations frequented by tourists. And just across the road from this row of shops, we find one of Eastbourne's most storied entertainment venues of all. This is the Royal Hippodrome Theatre, which was built back in 1883 and which stands today as the oldest theatre in all of Eastbourne. Over the years, the Hippodrome has hosted a variety of famous acts, particularly during its thriving music hall era in the early 20th century, having seen everybody from Charlie Chaplin to Harry Houdini and more grace its stage in the past. Though arguably past that heyday, the Royal Hippodrome remains in operation today, and it was beautifully restored back in 2019 as it continues to host shows throughout the summer season, yet another of the many things to do for those on holiday here. But while many of the buildings surrounding us here tell us the story of Eastbourne's rise to stardom as a popular seaside resort during its heyday in the 19th and 20th centuries, it's in this part of town where you can also find a few clues as to the town's history from even before that period. This small road leading back to the seafront, known as Marine Parade Road, was for a long time an important commercial route linking the inland part of Eastbourne with the coast. The large building in front of us here is the Albion Hotel, built in 1836 as one of the earliest modern hotels in Eastbourne. While historically, you would have also found an eclectic range of businesses operating on this street, from the storied Caffin Motor Dealers, one of the oldest in this part of England, to a locally run bakery, and the first library in Eastbourne. Nowadays, meanwhile, it's here on Marine Parade Road that we find the Crown and Anchor pub, one of the many popular alehouses lining the town's seafront. But long before people came to the seaside here to relax, drink a pint and do a bit of sunbathing, it was just a few yards away from where we are now that a small stream emptied into the English Channel. A small stream that was genesis for the town of Eastbourne centuries ago. Flowing down from the surrounding hills, this stream was historically known as the Bourne, deriving from an archaic English word simply meaning stream. And it was around the Bourne that people began settling at least 1,000 years ago, and possibly even further back in history than that. Now, in the medieval era, there wasn't much in the way of extensive settlement around the Bourne, but the area surrounding the stream came to be known initially as Bourne, one of a number of similarly named settlements along the coast of Sussex. As you might have guessed, it was this Bourne which eventually gave Eastbourne its name. The reason that the East was added to the name was because locals wanted to distinguish this area from another part of Sussex, also known as Bourne, which is correspondent to the modern town of Westbourne, near Chichester on the other side of the county. But as well as giving the town its name, the Bourne also provided livelihoods to the people who inhabited this area centuries ago. The mouth of the stream by the sea here was marked by a rudimentary landing point for boats arriving onto England's south coast, while there was a scattered collection of hamlets in the area where fishing and salt production were the main local industries in the centuries before seaside tourism emerged. Today, you can get a glimpse of a pre-resort era Eastbourne by venturing into an area known as the Old Town, about a mile inland from here. Although, even down by the seafront, there's plenty of other history to be discovered. With the splendid Eastbourne Pier now back in view, you might be surprised to learn that this historic boardwalk hasn't only been used as a pleasure pier and entertainment venue. For more than 30 years in the first half of the 20th century, paddle steamers actually operated ferry services from Eastbourne Pier to the French town of Boulogne across the English Channel. Although the boats did stop operating for a 6-year period between 1939 and 1945, a period otherwise known as the Second World War. Ferry trips to Nazi-occupied France were understandably never going to be a moneymaker. But as the British war effort came to encompass every corner of society, even Eastbourne Pier turned its role towards warfare. During the war, the pier was closed to the public and much of its wooden decking was removed, in an effort to prevent the Germans from using it as a landing point should they attempt an amphibious invasion of Britain, while the old dance hall, destroyed in the fire of 2014, was also used as a gun battery, with machine guns installed in its upper floors looking out to sea. Fortunately, such an invasion never came, but as we now make our way directly under the pier, Eastbourne was still heavily impacted by the Second World War. In the early months of the war, this seaside resort town was a destination for many child evacuees from London. But after the evacuation at Dunkirk in 1940, and fears of a German invasion via the south coast, most were evacuated again elsewhere, as Eastbourne soon found itself in the firing line. Throughout the rest of the conflict, Eastbourne suffered from extremely intense bombing by the Luftwaffe, with this town easily reached by enemy planes stationed in northern France. As a result, 187 people were killed by German bombs during the war here, while hundreds of houses and historic landmarks were destroyed, as Eastbourne was even recognised as the most raided town in England's southeast outside London during the Second World War. But as we look across the road towards the Royal Sussex Memorial, dedicated to local troops who served in the Boer War in South Africa at the turn of the 20th century, there are still many pre-Second World War landmarks which do remain standing to this day, often neighboured by more modern buildings that took the place of houses that unfortunately fell victim to the Luftwaffe's bombs. Of course, the more recent fates of the Claremont Hotel across the road from us here, and that of the Piers Dance Hall, show us that Eastbourne's historic landmarks still need to be treasured, even if there isn't an immediate threat from war. Although the Second World War wasn't the first time that this now rather idyllic seaside spot was being eyed up by an enemy army. We're now going to make our way off the seafront to head further inland. But if you are in Eastbourne and are walking the length of the town's extensive promenade, you will at one point encounter a huge old fort that was built during the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century. Known as the Eastbourne Redoubt, it's one of the last remaining circular forts that were built all along the southern coast of England when it was feared that Napoleon was seeking to launch an invasion of Britain. However, as was the case in the Second World War, no invasion was ever attempted, but Eastbourne's Redoubt Fortress, built in 1805, remains standing today as a reminder of that time. And it's still open to visitors during the summer too, with a couple of interesting museums inside to boot. So whether you're looking to soak up some sun or some history, we've already seen that there's plenty to see and do in Eastbourne. Although the area that we've been exploring so far is only a minuscule part of what is a rather large town in the modern day. The part of town down by the pier is certainly the most famous among visitors, but there's much more to Eastbourne than first meets the eye, and we won't even be able to cover all of the town's history and its main districts on this walk today. However, it is interesting to understand how Eastbourne, once upon a time a loose collection of fishing hamlets, has evolved into one of the largest towns in England's southeast, with a population of more than 100,000 people in the modern day. We know that the town grew more than 10 times in size during the late Victorian era, but this growth only continued as the 20th century rolled around, Eastbourne initially benefiting as seaside holidays became more widely accessible to Britain's masses in the pre-war period. And then the town retained a rather robust tourist industry in the post-war years, when many other seaside towns around the country began losing visitors to destinations abroad like Spain. In 2019, Eastbourne was even ranked as the 4th most popular seaside town in the UK, with more than 4.9 million tourists coming to the town every year. And that popularity is clear as day to see when walking the town's promenade on a sunny summer's day like this. Meanwhile, we now find ourselves on Terminus Road, which is lined with apartments, shops and restaurants as it stretches from the town centre down towards the beach. And while this central town artery has indeed changed much throughout the years, its popularity hasn't changed much through the generations. But when speaking about generations, you might know that Eastbourne here, for all its popularity, has a bit of a reputation as a place that seems to be exclusively frequented by the country's older generation. The statistics certainly seem to suggest that this is the case. People are on average 5 years older in Eastbourne than elsewhere in the country. But what's the driving factor behind this phenomenon? And does it really matter? Well, it's impossible to nail down one main cause for this town's popularity among Britain's elderly, but it's difficult to look past the weather as a point of particular appeal. That famous Eastbourne microclimate, which is working its magic today, making this an especially desirable place for people to move to after retirement. Of course, there's much more diversity in the town's population than its many retirees. But those who choose Eastbourne as their home in their golden years are rewarded with a place that offers some stonking weather and plenty of things to do, with entertainment venues like the Bandstand and the Hippodrome that we saw earlier often gearing their programmes towards this demographic. Plus, with boundless nature surrounding the town on all sides, and with the famous Beachy Head just a short distance away, Eastbourne offers those with a love for hiking and the countryside everything they need along with the sun and the sea. This trend means that while younger holiday makers have tended towards travelling abroad more regularly, Eastbourne has been able to continue drawing in older people throughout the years, people who often spend more time in town and provide great support to local businesses. There's certainly more to be said on the trend, but here we've stumbled across a rather grand church set back a short distance from the beach. Opened all the way back in 1839, this is Holy Trinity Church, which was built to serve the burgeoning community of people living permanently by the seaside in Eastbourne, as the modern resort town was taking shape. Of course, with ever more people coming to live in Eastbourne at the time, a new church was needed to provide them with a place of worship, as historically, the area's main church was the 1,000-year-old Church of St Mary the Virgin, located a lengthy walk away from here in the Old Town. That church, the oldest building in all of Eastbourne, still stands in the Old Town, which was the original hamlet of Bourne. However, Holy Trinity Church here, by the sea, soon overtook it as the most popularly frequented place of worship in the area, even lending its name to the road that we're walking along here, Trinity Trees. I'm not exactly certain of the origins of the street's name, though it's likely so called as it's lined with trees and passes by Holy Trinity. But what we can be certain of is that Trinity Trees was for a long time one of the most significant roads in the area, as it linked the hamlet of Bourne with its largest neighbour, another small hamlet named Sea Houses, roughly correspondent to the area just to the east of the pier, where you'll find the likes of the Queen's Hotel, Albion Hotel and more. In the modern day, Trinity Trees is lined by rows of grand houses, just a few of which make up the endless network of streets on which many people have lived while spending time in Eastbourne. Of course, as a popular resort town with a classy reputation through the decades, there have been a fair few famous faces to have graced Eastbourne streets too. We already know that a young King Edward VII was one of Eastbourne's most famous visitors during the Victorian era, but many others were regular holiday makers to the town in that period too. Lewis Carroll, author of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, was a particular fan of Eastbourne, staying in the town 19 times through his life, while the town was also often visited by political philosophers Karl Marx and Frederick Engels in the late 19th century, and even the French composer Claude Debussy, the man behind the famous piece Clair de Lune, and who even finished his famous work, La Mer, at Eastbourne's Grand Hotel back in 1905. There are many more famous names associated with Eastbourne that we could talk about too, but as we mentioned earlier on, we won't be able to fit all of this town's captivating history into this one tour, particularly as it's here at the end of Trinity Trees that we're coming to the end of our walk around Eastbourne. This famous seaside town of course spreads out much further, with a bustling shopping district in the area around the train station and the upper part of Terminus Road. But here we encounter the town's impressive war memorial, unveiled back in 1920, and which pays tribute to all the locals who lost their lives fighting in the 2 world wars. And unfortunately, it's here on the town's memorial roundabout that we've now reached the end of our walk around Eastbourne. A wonderful seaside town well worth the visit if you have the chance. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to making your own trip to Eastbourne sometime soon.